Let's get a sense now about what is likely to be on the agenda and how it's going to play out politically. Let's go over to Dr. Sreeram Chaulia, who's a foreign affairs expert and is with us here in studio. Yesterday we saw in Xi'an a lot of cultural diplomacy take place. Of course, there were talks, but really there were a lot of camera opportunities. Today is going to be the actual brass tacks, and it seems that this time round the big focus is very clearly trade. I mean, border issues are going to be touched on, concerns are going to be touched on, but that's not the focus. Do you see that as being a fair position for this maiden visit to take?
Well, trade is booming. It's close to 80 billion now. We have some concerns, and I think Prime Minister is going to reiterate those, because we've been saying this for the last several years now, that the deficit is going haywire and we need to control it. So I think that's going to be one of the focus areas. I was in China just last week, and we were in a structured dialogue with People's Daily, and they were interested in how we can bridge the trade deficit. So I think that's going to be on top of the agenda. The other very interesting thing that's going to happen today is the provincial leaders. We have 3 chief ministers from the Indian side and governors on the Chinese side who will be engaged in a dialogue. It's the first time, I think, ever that we're doing something like this. And that's significant because increasingly, if you look at, because we are neighbors, like provinces of southern China, like Sichuan, have more in common with, bordering provinces across the Indian side, and would want to open up trade and special facilities for their business people and so on. So all these are, hugely beneficial for the overall relationship. So yeah, they build the confidence. Of course, in a way, the economics and the politics cannot be separated. One of the things our Chinese partners keep saying is, let's just do business, talk money, and right, leave out the politics. But the point is, in China, which is a state-owned economy, which is controlled by the government, it's hard to really separate the two. Even investment decisions, the figures we're talking about, the B2B agreements are in many ways proxies for G2G, because government is behind the businesses.
Absolutely.
So state-controlled, state-owned enterprises dominate the scene there. They call them the elder sons of the republic.
Right.
So they are in the forefront, and they are going to be investing in India, in our railways, in our infrastructure, and so on. So in a way, you cannot separate the two. Even the economic...
It's a very careful balancing act.
Absolutely. Even the maritime Silk Road and the one road, one belt agenda of the Chinese, they say that it's economic, but the point is, it's also going to advance Chinese strategic interests.
Yeah.
So therefore, we can make a, classification purely for those purposes, but in reality, the two are intertwined. So I think politics is going to come in somehow or the other.
Sure. Dr. Chaulia, what do you think? What Zaka was saying there, that even, when it comes to issues like border disputes, none of this can be solved overnight or even over decades. But incremental progress, the fact that these are being flagged, that these are being discussed, that will send out a sufficient confidence-building signal.
I think Mr. Modi wants more than incrementalism. He's in a hurry. He wants to solve these problems. He wants to, etch his name in history as a major problem solver for India. And I think yesterday there was a private moment in the garden under the tree with President Xi Jinping, where he was alone with the translators only. And I think he must be telling them that, listen, let's have a one-on-one and try and solve this once and for all. And the buzzword in the PMO was that, they want a breakthrough. So while they may not be able to announce one which is dramatic and which is going to suddenly say the problem is solved and settled once and for all, I think he wants to speed up. Modi sees himself as a catalyst. And frankly, with his Make in India campaign, in a way we are like China in the 1980s. Deng Xiaoping said, no problems with neighbors, let's not get embroiled in military rivalries and tensions and problems, because right now we need to focus on large-scale economic growth with a conducive external environment. I think we need that too. We cannot afford to let this drag on forever. So I do hope that there is a sense of urgency which goes beyond incrementalism and which actually leads to a medium-term solution. I was in China just last week, where senior figures in the think tanks and in the government were saying that they believe that because Modi is, quote-unquote, a strong leader, and so is their president, they believe that in 5 to 10 years, we can actually finally draw the borders and seal them once and for all. And I think the solutions have to emerge, which are not new. They've been existing in the past. And Deng Xiaoping himself proposed something called a package deal way back, which was essentially freezing the status quo along the McMahon line. I think we're going to opt for more of these things in the future. In the past, we missed some opportunities to once and for all resolve this. But now I think what's happening is we are attaining a little sense of parity with the Chinese. So they will want to deal with us from a position of strength right now, relative strength, then 10 years down the line, potentially we could be their equals and have more bargaining power globally.
Right. Now, in that context, then, Dr. Chaulia, one of the things that which is likely to be pressed on by Prime Minister Modi, if not during this visit itself, where he's obviously mentioned it and will mention it again, but will be pressed on politically going ahead with China, is the deals which are being made with Pakistan, particularly that economic corridor. How do we work on that tripartite issue?
Well, the thing is, they object to our Prime Minister going to Arunachal Pradesh, but then we do the same when they are actually doing construction and are sending the People's Liberation Army into Pakistan-occupied Kashmir. And this new corridor connecting Xinjiang with Gwadar, which passes through disputed territory, is problematic because in a way it means that China is recognizing Pakistan's control over what we claim to be our sovereign territory. So in a way it's also a snub to us, and these things happen. They like to poke and needle us on sovereignty issues. So while the business goes on, they have not really been very flexible on these issues, and I think that's one of the stumbling blocks. It's a matter of debate as to who is ready and who is not ready for a final solution. But the Pakistan angle is, see, it's amazing. They have now created a 12,000 strong security force to guard the economic corridor that they're building in Pakistan. In other words, it's not a sane business decision given the security problems in Pakistan. India is relatively far, far safer.
Right.
There's no issue here in terms of return on investment. Our problem is more red tape and bureaucratic delays, right? Yeah. There's no security issue. So in spite of that, the fact that they have put in so much more in Pakistan means that, as I said before, the economics is, in the backdrop of it, is the politics. I was talking to them and saying, why are you investing in such a risky place like Pakistan from a pure business sense? They said, you see, we have to balance our relations. When we look at Pakistan and India, we have to have good relations with both. In other words, it's a code for saying that they still want to counter us.
Absolutely.
So that's the problem. The strategic trust is still missing.
And Foreign Affairs expert Dr. Chaulia is still with us to talk about sort of the nuances surrounding Prime Minister Modi's visit. Now, we've been talking about what the business dealings are going to mean. We've been talking about how far the political issue can be stretched. But let's also talk about, as my colleague Zaka described it earlier, the optics of the event. Yesterday we saw essentially a day of optics, lots of photo opportunities, visits to monasteries and other famous historical sites. Today, he's speaking to university students. Mr. Modi is pressing those buttons as well, very, very deliberately. Break that down for us.
Yeah, I feel the cultural diplomacy is a way for Mr. Modi to connect societies. So even though China is a very state-dominated political system, it was wonderful to see in Xi'an young people come out on the streets to greet him in large numbers, where, having crowds on Chinese streets is often considered to be a threat to the regime. So the fact that this is happening largely spontaneously, he's on Weibo now, talking to Chinese the netizenry, and I think, and the civilizational connect. Today is going to be in Tsinghua University speaking to Chinese students. I was just there in Tsinghua last week, and there was a lot of air of expectation. People are saying we're all waiting for Modi ji and all that. So clearly he wants to leave a lasting impression that will enhance our soft power. Because India needs to be desirable in the eyes of the whole society. Usually we are on page 5 or 6 of Chinese newspapers or global newspapers. But this visit is making global headlines. Even the Western ones are paying attention. New York Times is on the headlines. So clearly I think Mr. Modi has succeeded where previous leaders failed in creating that society-to-society connection. So educational institutions, cultural associations, monasteries, these are all part of, I think it's not purely optical. What he's trying to do is to make people feel that there's a deeper relationship, that people can feel heart to heart. And, we can talk about strategic affairs and economic give and take, but for average Chinese, it matters that Modi has prayed in a monastery, and the visuals went out. So I think, in a way, he wants to cement this relationship because we want to avoid conflict with them. We would like as much as possible to avoid competition with them. And all these things can only happen if at the societal level, even in a state-dominated system, there's some kind of empathy for India. There's some kind of understanding for India. And it's not seen as, often we see these opinion polls claiming that, many Chinese view India as a threat and vice versa. But I think he needs to melt those down because ultimately, if we have thick relations based on people-to-people understanding, that we'll go forward.
Right. Now, before we went into that break, we were talking about what China's relationship with Pakistan means for India, that economic corridor that was flagged by, we hear, at least from sources, by Mr. Modi in the meeting yesterday and is likely to be flagged again today. There are two other issues which have been very sensitive for India. One, of course, is China's presence in bordering waters, and the other is China's increasing presence in Sri Lanka. Now, with what's happening in Pakistan, how would you square these other two as well?
Yeah, we have had this theory of the string of pearls, and the Chinese are trying to encircle us. The Chinese believe that we are part of an American design to encircle them. So these mutual animosities and constructs have been hampering the strategic understanding. And I think the Chinese do realize that they overplayed their hand in Sri Lanka, and now there's a new regime that's more balanced. The same happens with Nepal. In the past, when the Maoists were ruling, the Chinese seem to have an upper hand, but now, after the Maoists have been defeated, we seem to be gaining. So, the leaders have talked about how we can avoid the zero-sum game and how the loss for one need not be a gain for the other. They've even mentioned that the discussions will touch upon India and China working together in Africa and in Latin America. So all these will have to be sorted out where we avoid extreme competition. To some extent, I guess, as large neighbors with ambitions of both being superpowers, we will clash to some extent. But how do we moderate this? Yes, before Prime Minister started the visit, he spoke about how it's going to be a new milestone in the way developing countries deal with each other. We've got to create a new model of interaction where a established power and a rising power do not inevitably clash but can coexist. That's the big challenge.
Dr. Chaulia, we're talking there with Zaka about the business deals which are likely to be signed today, the trade agreements which are likely to be put in place. Now, one of the issues which has come up in India-China relationships is China's insistence that India be a part of the One Road, One Belt agenda. How do you see that playing into the discussions which are going to be taking place as far as trade is concerned?
I think we're going to be okay with yoga and Tai Chi being paired up. But to subsume our own strategic corridors and economic connectivity projects like our Spice Route idea or our Project Mosam into the larger Chinese Silk Road, I think would be a stretch. Maybe the Chinese are going to make it conditional, as in the investments are going to be tied up to our acquiescence to the Silk Road project. They had Kolkata as a port for calling as part of the Silk Road and so on, and they claim that it is purely an economical project which is also going to bring us benefits. But I think we're going to be wary, because even if you look at the historic Silk Road, the Han Empire used to always guard the routes with their own military and their navies.
Right.
And the point is, in the past we've had Chinese submarines dock in Colombo, and they have put Sri Lanka on the map as one of the important nodes for the Silk Road. So again, it will tug at our strategic anxieties. And frankly, to be a great power, we need to have our own ideas and our own projects out there which match the Chinese. So while we cannot match them in terms of trade, because we are not a major mercantile power, we have an advantage in services. We need to come up with new ideas. The challenge for Modi and his team and for our diplomacy is how to work alongside this. Obviously, we cannot scuttle the Silk Road. That's a massive project with hundreds of billions backing it. But what we cannot do is lose our identity and just be allowed to be suborned into the Chinese project. So we need to keep our own identity, at the same time try and maximize the benefits, whatever we get from these investment projects that are central, for infrastructure, for power, for railroads. All of these can be in many ways shown as part of the Silk Road, but we should not lose, I think, our own pet projects which are still nascent and the drawing board right now, but we need to execute those in order to, if we say that we want a multipolar Asia where India is China's equal, we cannot be their junior partners.